90% of the fish are in 10% of the water. And that 10% from November to April for smallmouth bass is the deepest water you can find.
Time for the Angler Within podcast with Roy Bilby. So, Roy, maybe we should think about putting GPS tracking devices on each other when we're fishing.
In light of what happened last week, that would not be a bad idea.
I don't want to track you when we're not fishing. I'm not trying to say I want to stalk you or anything. I'm just saying it. I think that you should. I think that when we go out, maybe we should be wearing those. I made an assumption, and in doing so, I made an ass out of myself and you.
I was included in that.
When we talked early on Saturday morning, and you were fishing, and it was cold, and I had to run some errands and get some food in me. And I did those things, and I talked to Matt, and Matt came out. It was 7 o'clock when you and I talked. Matt didn't get here until 12. And wow. I made the hard assumption that you were down at the Crumhorn Access, and you were not.
Yeah,
you were at Silman Cove.
To set this up for everybody, you had called me and said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm actually fishing. And you said, where? And I reluctantly said, Goodyear. You're like, get out of here. And because I'd promised you a trip this fall.
Oh, by the way, I'm right down the street from you. I wasn't going to say that, but since you're asking, I'm actually within walking distance of where you are. No, not really. Well, I guess you could walk to where you were, but that you were a stone's throw away. You were not far away compared to usually.
Yep, 3 good long casts.
I would say longer than
that far.
But we didn't know that.
And the trip I had promised you was to Schoharie Creek when the beatdown is happening, which is right now, and it will last. But this is an annual trip I do the first or second week in November every year for the last 5 years with my primary care physician, who listens to our podcast, who is a dear, dear friend of mine, and who's a great fisherman in his own right. He's a blast to fish with because very analytical like I am. So every fish is telling you something and giving you information. And the two of us are constantly analyzing the bite and dialing it in. Like if he sets the hook first, if he hooks up first, loads up, I'm like, was that a strike or was it just a pressure bite? And if I load up first, he's asking me that. And we're always working off each other. More often than not, we come out, even Steven or within a fish or two of each other. And he's the guy that I go to Goodyear and have those 80 smallmouth days with in November. And we had been looking forward to this trip for so long because we haven't fished together all summer. And at the last minute, he had to cancel. And this is a trip that I do exclusively with him, although I have taken my son there, but it's a pretty special trip that I just do with Greg. And I found out a day before, so I didn't change my plan. I'd been holding off on going there to do this with him, but we will hopefully get there. So that's why I was on that lake that day and why I hadn't called you, because I'd promised you a trip to Schoharie Creek. And as soon as my phone rang that day and you called me, I'd only been fishing about 10 minutes when you called and I saw your name come up on my phone. I went, oh boy.
We can go on technicalities on where you promised to take me geographically. That's fine. If that's what makes you feel better, that's fine.
If that's what makes you feel okay about
yes, apparently that's what's going to take. That's fine. But I can see why I know what you're saying. I get it. So my feelings aren't hurt. It's okay.
When I saw your name come up on my phone, I went, oh no. I hope he doesn't ask what I'm doing.
Yeah.
That was your first question.
What are you doing?
But I'm not gonna lie.
To bring it back to current, at that point, we didn't know we were in different parts of the lake until hours later when Matt and I pedaled way upstream for towards Cooperstown. We were, we were headed the Milford route. I'm just saying locations today. Who cares? Everyone knows where Goodyear is. This is a very interesting body of water because there's the main reservoir lake area and then there's a river.
the upper Susquehanna.
The upper Susquehanna that feeds. Does that feed from Otsego?
Yes.
It does. Okay. So
It's called the Upper Susquehanna from Otsego Lake down to the dam at Goodyear is, well, Goodyear Lake. What runs into it is the Upper Susquehanna. What comes out of the dam at Goodyear, it is actually the headwaters of the Susquehanna River that flows down through Pennsylvania.
so it
So,
makes it very special. But anyway, we're
yeah.
pedaling.
Yeah, we planned on connecting later in the
Yes,
day.
we were gonna link up. I thought you were. I go, you're at the launch, right? Yeah, yeah, I'm here at the launch. And we kept on still. I was asking where you were, but we were not clarifying where you were.
I
So
said I was
finally,
at the launch when you came down in your kayak last time
you didn't say
because
that.
yes, I
No.
did.
Well, then I didn't catch it.
It must be you didn't catch it
Fine.
because I was trying to explain the only time that you met me on the lake there was the first time you pedaled down in your kayak and you said, "Man, I'm going to do this for cardio."
But
But
anyway, we went a long ways, and I even checked in with you at one point, and we verified still going to meet up. And then I said, we're still a ways away from you. You're like, really? You're like, how long you been on the water for? Because you figured I should have been if it had been heading your direction south.
right
That would have been different. But
at
yeah,
that point where you told me where you were below that bridge, 3 miles.
how bored is everyone listening right now? They're like, we get it. What are we getting into today, Roy?
What we're getting into is the November bite that is just a ballistically on fire bite when you hit it right. And I mean, your lake, I've had a number of 80 plus days in November
Mhm.
on that lake. All with jigs, but I caught them on every rod I had. I had 5 rods in the boat, caught them on every single rod that day, and it started out like you called me within like I'd been fishing 10 minutes, and I hooked and landed fish on my first 3 casts and went, "Oh, man, this is gonna be one of those days." And the 4th cast, I missed a strike as soon as it was in the water, and then just about back to the boat, I missed a hard strike right below the boat, and I'm vertically jigging it for a while, and nothing's happening. But my 5th cast, I caught another one, and then you called, and I said, confessed where I was, and said, it's a good bite. I had them on my first 3 casts consecutive, and I think this is going to be one of those days. And you talked about coming down to meet me. Apparently, you talked about coming up to meet me, but I was down the lake. So after our conversation, I went back to fishing and I caught a couple more and it stopped. I mean, like somebody flipped a switch and I could not buy a strike. I'm like, what happened? And the nearest thing I could figure is I came in on the last 30 minutes of a major feeding period. But when I got home, I checked the salooner tables and that was not the case at all. It was a minor feeding period, but it was not what I thought it was. The morning played out and it took me a while to I was picking up one here, one there, very scattered. The bait that was working for me in the beginning was a 4-inch Bass Pro Shops XPS grub in Green Pumpkin Magic on a 1/4 ounce ball head jig, painted black. And I mean, sharpened my hook, used my loop knot, and they were all over it, but it stopped as quick as it started. And so I tried a Ned rig. I tried uh Fat Albert grub. I tried a tube. I picked up one fish on each bait, but they were really spread out. I mean, do you know where I was fishing? You know where the deep hole is in the bottom of the lake, where that kayak launch is, that new launch they put right off the state land? Right in front of that basin is 40-foot deep. That is the deepest water in the lake. And there are fish all over that basin. If you're there in January, they are stacked in there. But this is November. That's the wintering hole, and it's a huge, gigantic basin. I would wager probably 90% of the smallmouth in that lake are there in January. And it's just loaded with fish.
Do you walk out there in January and drill a hole in the ice?
Oh, yeah.
Is that
Oh,
where you
yeah.
go to? That's where you hit?
I was there one January. I got to share this story. I was there one January. Uh, And I was one of 6 boats on the lake. It was January 6th. I don't remember what year, I remember it was January 6th. The lake had not frozen yet, and the only place we could ice fish was smaller ponds that had, like 4 inches of ice. But your lake, I mean, there's current. It takes a little bit longer to freeze, and the lake was clear. I mean, crystal clear. You could see the bottom in 15 feet. I'm fishing along the perimeter. I'm not fishing out in the 40-foot hole, but there were several boats out there. One boat in particular, it was like a 16-foot aluminum V bottom. They had two these guys had two folding chairs and a card table set up in the middle of the boat, and they were laughing hysterically. Like every 20 minutes, they were just laughing hysterically. I was starting to get aggravated because I wasn't seeing them swinging a rod or loading up, with a rod fighting fish. I assumed that, here it is, 8 o'clock in the morning, January. These guys are out in a boat drunk. That's that's not cool at all. You know, somebody's going to drown today. So eventually, I took the time to motor over to them, and they saw me coming, and they said, "You're not going to believe this." I said, "I'm coming to see what's so funny," because I assumed they were drunk. They're like, "Check this out." They had taken an inner tube from a lawn tractor tire, from a rear wheel of a lawnmower, a small inner tube, and they had taken a tip up, and they put about 30 feet of line down, baited it with a minnow, and set the flag, and pushed it away from their boat, and had a small nylon quarter-inch rope tied to it, and they just let it float out there, and they got 3 flags and pulled the inner tube in and hand lined the fish in. Open water, they're still fishing with a tip up because they have it floating on an inner tube, and they were laughing their butts off. I took pictures of them that day and told my dad the story because he and I had always talked about putting tip ups on a board in open water and floating them out there and seeing if we could catch fish. And here these guys were doing it pretty smart with a little inner tube. And they caught 3 smallmouth doing that. I was catching them out there in 25 and 30 foot, but I had a rod and reel and a jig. And yeah, that's where they are in January. But this time of year, I'm fishing the break and the drop. Now, in that part of the lake, the sides drop really fast. They're really steep. I mean, more than a 45-degree angle. I mean, they just drop right down. And that's what I'm fishing in November. But like I said, it had slowed right down. So I finished going down eastern side, which is where I catch a lot of my fish. And then I went into the channel cut, Silman's Cove. It's like its own little body of water. And sometimes the channel that leads into that will hold fish, but there were none on this day. So I went back up to where I had started and made another pass all the way down through. And at that point is when you had called me and said, I said, "You're not here yet?" You said, "No, we're almost to the bridge. Not the first one, not the one in Portlandville, but the next one." And I said, the railroad bridge?" You go, "Yeah. How close are we to the launch?" I said, "Well, you're about a mile and a half from the Crumhorn launch on the north end, but I'm at the launch on the south end. You're going away from me." And at that point, we both realized what had happened. And you said, "All right, so I guess we're not meeting up. We're just gonna continue to fish here." And now I had told you about the deep hole I know about by the Portlandville Bridge, because there was a November when I first learned about that wintering hole when my son was like 12 years old. I had my very first aluminum bass boat. We were headed up there to go under that bridge. And this is a good tip for anybody. I mean, you can use your electronics to find wintering holes. Smallmouth, well, largemouth for that matter too, but I'm talking smallmouth right here. In October, late October, early November, when the water temperature, like I was talking about before, hits that magic 48-degree mark and starts working its way down to 42, 40 degrees and lower, that's when they start piling into these wintering holes. And I mean, deep is a relative term. All right. In Goodyear Lake, deep is 40 feet, it's 25 feet. And there's a lot of that water in that lake, but the only place it's 40 foot is in that basin, very way down on the south end by that kayak launch. And that's why I think so many of those fish pile into there. But as you go up the river, right below that Portlandville Bridge, I was driving up through there one November with my son. We were bundled up. He did have his jacket on. And as we're approaching the bridge, the only thing I had on the dash of that boat, and again, we're talking 91, 92, probably a little bit later than that, because he had to be probably 10, 11. So it was probably mid 90s. But we're coming up to that bridge, and the flasher on the dash was reading 22, 20, 20, 18, 20. All of a sudden, it went right up to 6 foot. And I cut the throttle because I thought we were going to hit something. And then we're we're coasting to a stop, and it starts to drop right back down to 15 foot just as we get to the bridge. And I turned to him and I said, "Oh man, there's a hump there." So we turned around and checked it out with that flasher, and we started fishing it. And that's when I first learned about wintering holes way back, 30 years ago, 30 plus years ago, that in November, those fish will start migrating to those deeper reaches because that's the warmest water in the lake throughout the winter. And they'll be there until April. And they stack up like cordwood. And this is one of those scenarios when 90% of the fish are in 10% of the water. And that 10% from November to April for smallmouth bass is the deepest water you can find. And again, it's a relative term. If you've got a shallow river that runs 4 to 6 foot most of the time, but you've got a few holes that are 12 foot, 15 foot, they're going to be piled in there and stacked like cordwood. And it's basically a captive audience until April. And they are going to eat when you fish there because there's a lot of competition for whatever gets in there. And it's one of those scenarios where if you know where to go and what to throw, you can look like a genius and you can have those, 50, 60, 80 plus days. I do it every year because of what I've learned that these fish do this time of year. So this particular day that you and I are talking about, it started off with a bang, but it took me forever after we talked to break double digits and hit 10 and then 11, 12. By noon, I finally broke 20 and thought, well, it has gotten a little bit better, but they were still one here, one there. They were just not grouped up. And I said, if I wait these fish out long enough, sooner or later, they're going to start feeding again and I'm going to hit a group. And it did happen, but it didn't happen until like the last 2 hours, maybe hour and a half that I fished. It was my third pass through my area because I know the fish are there. They're just not biting. That's where they are in the first half of November. Then they're going to start migrating to that 40 foot. But it's a very slow progression. It happens over several weeks. So you can stay on those fish. It's kind of like running a tide, except it's slow and drawn out. And I knew they were there. They're not going to leave. Their movements are dictated now by light exposure, the length of our daylight period each day, and by the water temperature. They're locked in. So I knew eventually they would bite again. I was just hoping it would be before dark, and it was. But as I started that third run, here comes a bass boat flying down into that bottom end, cuts their engine, and immediately both stood up, run to the front deck, and are staring down. I went, "Oh, these guys are live scopers." And both of them just stood there. They're making cast, and I could see them dragging baits, but their heads were looking straight down the entire time. But every once in a while, they'd hook up and they'd net a real decent fish. And it looked like they were catching walleye because they were fairly longer fish. Now, I was catching smallmouth and walleye, but I wasn't catching walleye of any size. They were borderline keepers, which I ended up letting go. But I started to get into a few smallmouth and I wanted to go over and try that deep hole, but they pulled in just as I was getting ready to do that, and I said, "All right, I'm just gonna stay where I am. I'm not gonna crowd them." And they were staying in one area, but it was the one area I wanted to check. So I was just waiting for them to move on, but they didn't. They stayed there in one spot for an hour, and I could see them bringing in fish, but then my bite fired up, and it fired up big time. I caught, I think, 18 in an hour. At one point, it was like every cast, I was either hooking up and landing a fish or hooking up and one was getting off, or I was missing a strike. And it was just cast after cast after cast. And at one point, I got snagged. I went over to get the snag loose, but I had fed it a lot of slack because I fished around it for a while. But then I got tangled in my line and I said, all right, at this point, I got to go get it. But I'm using braid and it got tangled and wrapped so bad. I was there trying to get that loose from the snag and get untangled from my other line for about 8 minutes. I had my head down and I'm trying to finally, I just popped the line and I lost my jig. I ended up cutting my other line and retying everything because it was just going to be a lot quicker at that point. When I looked up, those two guys in that bass boat that were out there live scoping and catching fish had moved right in on top of me because I had my head down and they must have thought, hey, he's not watching now. They moved right in on top of me. I mean, I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" They were catching fish out there, but apparently they saw me hooking up cast after cast after cast. But the thing is, once I got retied, I backed out. They moved on. They didn't get bit there, and my bite was over too. But I had caught 18 in an hour, and I fished another half hour. I may have picked up one or two more. I did the last 15 minutes I had. I didn't care at that point. They were still fishing that deep hole. I went right over and fished where I wanted to check it. It was away from there where they were, and I didn't move on in on top of them. I actually ran past where they were and went farther down the stretch and started. And I did have two good strikes there, missed them both. But I ended up today with 40 smallmouth, four walleye, a perch, and a rock bass. But bass wise, I had 40 and I thought, well, it's not 80, but I turned my day around. I was proud of that because I knew the fish were there. Sooner or later, they're going to bite again. And I just waited them out and they fired up again. And I was in the right stretch when they did. And it lasted for 18 smallmouth. But on my drive home, I realized I not only turned my day around by doubling what I had, but if there had been two of us in the boat, I got my half of the 80. And Greg and I usually match each other fish for fish within one or two. So it had the potential, even though there was a good strong bite to start, and then it was pretty weak until like the last hour and a half of the day, it had the potential to be an 80 fish day. But apparently I could only catch my half. That's how my day went. And when you had called me and you were up by that bridge and we realized that we were miles apart at that point and gave up the plan to connect with each other. I had told you it's just as well this bite has faded terribly. It's not the day it started out to be because at that time I was still
Yeah,
struggling. I was still in the teens and
which
what happened to
in the
my bite?
teens, it's just bogus. I was talking to Matt. Matt and I were looking at each other when you were saying that you weren't doing that good. We felt a little bit better because we had skunked, and you're in the teens. I know you should be putting up 80. I
Yeah.
know, but
Yeah, that's what you said. This is supposed to be an 80
I don't
fish
think
day."
I've
I
ever
said,
caught.
"Yeah, I know."
I don't know when the last time was that I caught in the teens anything in a day, but it's okay. I'm not you. It's different. It just shows the
Well,
difference
you
of honing the craft. Honing the
yeah,
craft. I'm a Padawan. I'm a Padawan compared to Roybi Wan Kenobi.
I I spent 40 years writing it all down and approached it my life depended on it. And
Roybi Wan Kenobi.
yeah, that's the word for this podcast.
That's
Don't
gonna be the title. Yes, sirree.
uh,
So, what are the go-tos right now? Okay, you stumble upon your electronics. You're showing what you're looking for as far as a deep hole.
Yep.
It's sudden. You start getting buck fever. You're looking into your box. Hopefully, you already have a rod rigged with something that's different than what you were already throwing around? What are you loading up with?
The water temperature was 45. It was right in the middle of that range. And a couple more weeks, they're going to start pulling out, inching out deeper and deeper and deeper. When the water temperature gets that cold, their metabolism has slowed down. Everything has slowed down. This is the time to put away your crankbaits, your jerk baits, A rigs, at your moving baits. All right. They're not going to chase. That's not going to happen. They're looking down. And because they're following the bottom contours, inching out every day, a little deeper, a little deeper, a little deeper. And so I'm throwing this is what's always worked for me. In November, I'll have 5 rods, every one rigged with some type of a jig. I'm going to have 2 rods rigged with ball head jigs, quarter ounce, either painted black or unpainted. One is going to have a Bass Pro Shops XPS grub, either 4 or 5 inch, typically 4 inch. In Green Pumpkin Magic, I'm going to have a 5 inch Fat Albert grub on the other jig with in either green pumpkin, pumpkin seed, or June bug. And that to me depends on the water clarity. If I've got really clear water or lightly stained water, I'm throwing green pumpkin. I'm almost always throwing a quarter ounce jig because these fish are deeper now and you want it to get it down there. I don't want 3/8 because that's too heavy unless you got a whole lot of wind, but that makes this kind of fishing really tough. So I'm typically throwing a quarter ounce head. The XPS grub I'll use in 4 inch, and the Fat Albert from Zoom, that's a 5 inch grub anyway. So that covers both of those. You can throw a 3 inch grub, but you're going to catch smaller fish. And they are feeding now. You can't really throw a bait that's too big. So that takes care of my 2 grub rods. On another rod, I'm going to have some type of a tube. Oh, and I'll throw that June bug Fat Albert if the water's off color and muddy, which your lake, if we get a lot of rain, it gets muddy and you could still go out and catch 60, 70 smallmouth because they're used to it. But you got to use the darker colors at that point. Now in the tube, I'm going to throw I in your lake, I like a Strike King Bitsy tube. Other lakes, I'll throw a 3 inch Bass Pro Shops tender tube. If I'm in the Mohawk River, I'm going to throw and bigger smallmouth yet, I'm going to throw the Strike King coffee tube. That's a big tube. That's 3.5 inches, and it's a big, thick tube. And I'm using a lot of different shades of green pumpkin, watermelon candy, which is like green pumpkin with red and green flake, a straight green pumpkin with a purple flake. You can't go wrong with green pumpkin. Mark Davis, who was the first angler to win the Bassmaster Classic and Angler of the Year in the same year, and then went on to receive 2 other AOY titles, was interviewed one time and they asked what were his favorite 3 colors in soft plastic, and his answer was green pumpkin, and green pumpkin.
Right. Yes, you mentioned that before. Can I ask a dumb
Can't
question?
Sure.
What are you using as a jig head with your tubes?
There's jigs that are made specifically for tubes. They have a cylindrical shaped head. I like, and the hook eye usually comes out somewhere in that tubular piece of lead. I like it to come out very close to the front so I can drag the tube and make it look like a crawfish. I use the Bass Pro Shop tender tube head. I use the Bass Pro Shops slip-in tube head. I use them in quarter ounce and eighth ounce, but I prefer the quarter ounce because I can feel what it's doing better. If it's really shallow and that's where they're located, which isn't the case this time of year, that's more of a summertime deal, I'll go to eighth ounce because it snags less in the rivers and stuff. I think if it falls too slow for me this time of year, I want to get it down to where those fish are because they're not generally suspended in the water column right now. They're right off the bottom. Matter of fact, some of the fish I was catching that day had mud on their bellies. They're already belly to the bottom. So that's what I use in a tube. And you can get them from every jig manufacturer makes them. And it's a matter of personal preference. The tender tube head that Bass Pro Shop sells has the hook eye a little bit farther, maybe the length of the cylindrical part, it's maybe an eighth or a quarter of that back from the front, but their slip-in tube head, it's right to the front. And I prefer that. I just think your tube, it doesn't spiral as much on the drop. With the line tie a little bit farther back, it's going to spiral a lot more on the fall. And I don't necessarily prefer that. I prefer a straighter drop. And you get that with the hook eye more towards the front. I will have a fourth rod rigged with a Ned rig with a Ned style jig and one of the Z-Man plastics on it. And I will have a fifth rod rigged with another Ned head jig, but I'll have a Berkeley Maxent Little General on that. Basically, I use that as a Ned rig on steroids. It's bigger, it's got a larger diameter, and it's loaded with Maxent, and they are going to eat it. And those are the 5 rods that I had with me that day. Like I said, I caught fish on every rod. For a while, that grub was the deal for most of them. But then they started hitting that Ned. I was using a Z-Man TRD, which is a 3-inch straight worm, and I would believe I was using peanut butter and jelly, and they were slamming that. But once they stopped, I went back to the grub. Earlier, it was the XPS grub, the 4-inch in Green Pumpkin Magic. But when I went off the Ned rig because they stopped hitting that flurry of those 18 fish in the afternoon, every single one on that Fat Albert grub in Green Pumpkin, and they were belting it. And when you get those hard strikes, when they belt it hard, like I mean, they walked up and sucker punched it. That's an indication that there's a lot more fish in that area because they've got to get it before somebody else does. And again, that theory that I have about that proved itself to be true because they were hitting it hard and I caught 18 of them. And that's just the ones I landed. There were a lot of others, at least half as many, if not as many, that hit it and were hooked, but pulled off or jumped off. And the ones that I landed, they were choking it. They had it really, really good. They were fully committed to that bait. But what's going to happen now is as this water is going to continue to cool. We had snow at our house for 2 days, 3 days ago. Yesterday, we had rain overnight after 2 days of snow. I was shoveling my deck 2 days in a row. That's how it was solid white and you couldn't see grass. It was all white. I'm like, this is going to be great for the opener, the gun season for our deer, and 3 more days, and then it stayed in the upper 30s and rained overnight, and everything was green in the morning. But we had snow last night, and by the afternoon, that was gone. So no white for deer season for me, but we'll get it eventually. My point is, we had a couple nights that were 28 degrees, 27 degrees when I got up in the morning. And that water temperature is going to continue to drop, especially on these cloudy days when the sun's not hitting the water and trying to maintain that temperature. It was 45 when I was there the day you and I were looking for each other. It's probably 42 now, maybe 41, and they're still there. They're just going to work a little bit deeper. So what you need to do if you're willing to go out and brave the elements, put on layers, always wear your PFD. If you go in that water, you can't react now like you think you can because when that water is 40 degrees, you've only got a couple minutes to react and your reaction time slows down. Your mind wants you to do it, but you move so slow because your core temperature is dropping fast and your body can't react. So please, I always wear a PFD this time of year, and you'd be smart to do the same. That's the law in New York State. They made that a law like 6 years ago that November 1st to May 1st, you must wear a PFD. It cannot just be in the boat. You have to have it on. And they made that a law to save lives. And I've done it faithfully ever since because I think it's smart. I think they're right. But those guys that were live scoping, neither one of them had a vest on. And this was mid-November. And they should have had their vest on. So please, if you're going to go out and do this kind of fishing, whether it's the law or not, be smart, wear a PFD so that you can continue to go out and fish and keep doing what we all love to do.
Yeah, do us a
But
favor and don't die.
yeah, please don't die. We can't afford to lose any listeners. So
Yeah, really.
yeah. So
Do us a
so
favor,
just putting a little plug
never
in.
mind leaving your family behind. We don't want to lose the listener. That's we're that's great.
Priority.
Well, listen, while you're busy not dying, slide into Roy's DMs on Instagram at all lowercase Roy Bilby.
And continue to throw jigs, slow them down, let them feel the bottom. The fish will find them, and they will help you tap into your angler within.